First of all, good evening and thank you so much for joining. My name is Dikshit and I'm the Vice President of this club, of the Product Based Club. And welcome to the fourth event of TPB of the Product Based Club on the user design topic. Uh, this is our uh, this is our club logo. Can you go to the next screen, please? Yeah. So our vision is to help students to be successful product managers and they are effective contributors to the company. Also, our mission is to spread awareness about product management to the UT Dallas students. Next screen, please. Yeah, these are some of the events. So we had the last event was on user research by Shiva, and we have completed three events till date, which is PM overview, strategy and vision, user research. This is our fourth event, which is on user design. Uh, we will be having two speakers for. We are having two speakers for this event. The next event is on 18th of November, which is a workshop, design workshop on balsamic tool, which will be taken by Dr. Anwesha. And then we have following events like analytics, execution, and technology for the product managers. So let me introduce our two speakers. So first one is Anwesha. She is a product manager at Hopper Hotels. And the next one is Sophia. Sophia is a lead product designer at Big Commerce. Uh, Over to you guys, Anwesha and Sophia, and would love to hear more from you. Thank you so much again for hosting this session, and we are looking forward to learning more from you guys.
Absolutely. Give me 1 minute. I think I lost Sophie again.
Wait, I'm here.
No, like on the visual.
Oh.
Give me a sec. I'm trying to figure out how. I'm trying to get that view back.
Well, I can see you. You look great.
You do too. Does anyone know how to make that happen? Someone who uses Teams pretty frequently?
Actually, you would only see the picture of the person who is speaking. So if Sophie is in mute, you wouldn't be able to see her while you speak.
I can't see anyone at the moment. So I'm trying to figure out if there's an easier way to see one person. Because I think what it's doing is it's gone into this full screen mode for Teams.
Exactly. In your full screen mode, like if you are the only one speaking and everybody's in mute, you won't be able to see their face.
Well, I wasn't speaking. And I couldn't see Dikshit. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do, is figure out if there's a better way of doing this. Okay. Anyway,
Anwesha, is it because you're in presentation mode? Like what if we just didn't? Yeah. What if we just made this view really big? Can you see us in this view?
No.
No. Okay.
Yeah.
Where's the shot?
I know. I know. Let's see.
Let's try something. So can you go to Teams?
Actually, you know what? I've got it. Let's do it. Sophie, I can see you. Let's keep it in this view.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's do that. That's good view.
Great.
I can see you now. Perfect. All right. Okay. So Sophie and I are going to talk about how PMs can design. And the idea behind what we're talking about is really that you'd be working as a product manager with designers, or if you're in a really small company, you're going to end up doing it yourself. And as a product manager, understanding how designers work, what are some ways in which you're going to work with your designer, or how do you think like a designer? All of those are important and relevant. And so Sophie and I are going to walk you through a framework that you could pretty much adapt to wherever you're working, whether it's a B2B, a B2C, whether you've got a designer, you've got a shared designer, or you're designing yourself. We're going to walk you through a framework that'll help you navigate that as you start out being a PM in a company. A little bit about the two of us. Sophie, why don't you go first?
Sure. Hey, everyone. I'm Sophie. I'm a lead product designer at Big Commerce, which is an e-commerce platform building company, kind of like Shopify, but a little bit more enterprise. So that's me.
And I am Anwesha. I actually am a UTD alum, so it's really nice to be back talking to UTD students again. I'm a product manager at Hopper Hotels, and I was also previously in travel as a data scientist and a product manager. So I've got the technical background and a very strong data analysis background that I bring into product management. So with that, what are we going to talk about? Like I said before, we're talking about a framework. We'll start with defining the project. That's always step one, right? What is the problem we're trying to solve? And from there, we'll start talking about the design. What are the different things tools that are, at our fingertips that we could use to create and conceptualize the design, the look and feel of the product that we're trying to build. We'll talk about validation. How do we make sure that what we're building is really what users want, and we're not completely off the mark, and our product will never be bought by anybody, right? So validation is a key part of it. And then finally, how do you hand off once the design process is done? I say done, but we'll get to that part later. It's never really done. But when it's done and you want to hand it off to engineering, how does that work? So let's get started. One thing before I go into anything else is that your partnership with your designer is going to really make or break your product. There is no other way of saying it, because what's in your head is what your product designer is going to help you visualize, is going to help you make into a reality. And how well you communicate what you're thinking, how well you communicate what you want out of the project, what the business goals are, is really going to sort of set the stage for how well your designer is set up for success. The other thing to remember is that your designers don't work for you, they work with you. It's very, very important to understand that they have a creative process, they have a vision, and that creative process is what creates the magic. So the way I say it is, I do the doodles and my designer creates the magic. There's something they do, and they're phenomenal with what they do. So if you don't have good user experience in a product, it's very hard for your product to succeed, because you're going to miss out on perspectives. You're going to miss out on things that will actually make your product more usable, more appealing to the user base, and it'll help you retain your users. So that's the key takeaway from this talk, right? When we start with a project, we start with, as always, KPIs. So you start with the problem you want to solve. Is this a feature? Is this an experiment? How big is this going to be? Is this going to be a big launch that I need a separate go-to-market strategy for? You're going to figure out, here's the key problem I'm trying to solve, and how do I want to address it? The mode of addressing it. From there, you're going to build yourself a business case, an idea one-pager, where you're going to talk about, why does the customer need it? Why do you think the customer needs it? What are the KPIs you're trying to hit if you solve this problem? How do you know this is a problem, right? And these are all going to be, at this point, conjectures or something you might have collected from surveys, or just things you've heard on the off, with customers. You've met with them and they've a few hints here and there, and you kind of put together this idea one-pager. From there, you go to hypotheses and assumptions. For example, if I build this, prediction of how my airline prices are going to be, I'm going to get more trust and therefore more conversion. That's a hypothesis. At this point, you may or may not have data that you can definitively say, oh, the conversion lift is going to be 10%. But you have a hypothesis that this is what's going to happen. So you're at this point figuring out, I've got these hypotheses, I have data or I don't have data. And if I don't have data, I want to figure out a way to collect data. And from there, you're going to head into business objectives, where you're basically going to say, here's my problem. Here were the hypotheses I came up with, and here's the expected KPIs, metrics, or findings I'm hoping to get to. It doesn't always have to be numbers. That's why I added in the findings part, because sometimes the whole purpose of an iteration is to learn more. So that's really important to remember, right? So at this point, you've got your problem definition. in your head or on paper in a document somewhere. No one else has seen it. This is all you, right, as a product manager. Then you meet with your designer. And this is really early on in the process. You're probably not giving your designer like anything material to go off of. It's really just a brainstorming session. You want to sit down with them and say, okay, I've got a problem. Here's why our product, I think, does not solve this problem. My assumption is backed up by research I've done, data I've found, clients I've spoken to, users who've dropped a note, feedback from customer support, whatever it might be. Here's what I don't know about this. I think this is the problem, but I don't know all of this stuff that would help me validate that this is truly a problem. I've got some hypotheses and I've got some ideas of how we can solve it. You're not really directing your designer to do anything at this point. You're just saying, this is my problem. Solve it. How would you achieve the business objectives I'm trying to achieve? I might have ideas. One of the things I love to do, I love sketching it out, just doodles. It can be anything from whiteboard to sketch, to like a very rough wireframe, which Sophie will talk about later. It can be stick figures. It can be scribbles on a sheet of paper. But sometimes it helps communicate the idea, maybe we could do this and it would solve the problem. And you want to talk to your designer up front about, oh, by the way, here are things we absolutely can't do. An example for us would be, you want to touch the shop process for a hotel booking? No can do. The latency is crazy. You want to change how that works. You want to change the flow. It's going to be really hard. So we have to navigate these constraints. That's something that you want to tell your designer. That doesn't mean your designer is going to have to adhere to those constraints. Your designer, in fact, always should build the realm of all possibilities, the dream state. How you implement it is something that you figure out later. But your designer should know that while they're designing something, it might be the moon and you may not be able to actually get to it in the near future. And that's important. So at this point, you're really just communicating a whole bunch of ideas. You're telling your designer why you think this is a problem so that they can start thinking about the business problem themselves. And designers have a different way of approaching business problems, which Sophie will talk about, but knowing this information actually sets them up for success because they have the context, they know what you're trying to solve, and they probably have a better way to solve it than you know. So this step is actually critical. I know a lot of PMs don't do this. They kind of just come in and say, here's what I want you to do. Don't ever do that with your designer. That's just not cool. Just don't do it. Don't tell them what to do. Tell them what you need, right? And then, Sophie.
Yeah. So if you've been attending all of these sessions, I believe you already had a session about user research. So we're not going to go too much into it here, but to kind of help take some of those concepts that you learned about in that earlier session and place them into this timeline. This is about the time in a project where you would start to get into some generative research, right? So digging into the problem space, understanding how and why users are behaving a certain way, digging into their motivations both in and out of your product, right? Other products they might be using to help them accomplish a goal. And then the pain points and frustrations that they might be encountering in your product or in your experience, and if and how they are overcoming them, right? And go to the next slide for me. So these are some of the methods. You've probably learned a little bit about them already, but these are the types of things that you might employ in this phase, right? So going out and talking to people one-on-one, getting groups of users together and talking to them about a specific topic, going and visiting a user in their environment, right? Whether that's at their home or at their office, and watching them interact with your product and looking at the environment that they're in and the context that's happening around them. Having them do a diary study over time, right? And cataloging their experience, sending out surveys or doing, design, like participatory design workshops and exercises. So yeah, you can head to the next slide. So then once you've spent a good amount of time understanding the problem space and how your users are experiencing your product, your feature, your service, that's when you'll actually start to sit down and map out that user flow, right? So this is where you look at, you visualize, right, how the user is interacting with your product or your service. You catalog those touch points over time, other channels that they might be moving in and out of in your experience, and their relationship to the overall ecosystem. And this is also where you can, start to layer in the goals that the user is trying to achieve, right? The decisions that they have to make and where they're experiencing that frustration to help you outline your opportunities and where you want to explore and how you could potentially solve the problem. So if you could go to the next slide, this is just, a quick example of mapping the user flow. Just in case, you're not quite sure what I'm talking about, you've probably seen this before. So this is one way that you could do it. Let's go down to the next slide. Okay,
all right.
Back to you.
So the user flow is actually a great place for you as a PM to pick up from where your designers kind of done all of this research, found out these user flows for you. You sit down and figure out use cases. These are pure business use cases, right? I want my user to do this, get to this point, it ends in a transaction of some kind, financial, or they end up giving you some information, or they end up monitoring something, right? List all these use cases. And what I like to do is I like to use Miro or XMind or one of these different tools to just take those user flows and basically be like, here are the 5 paths they can take from this screen, right? And here's all of the things they end up doing. And at the end of it, here's what I get. I get a number. If I had X number of customers going down this use case, I would end up getting X dollars or X% conversion. Like that's my hypothesis, right? So define the value of each use case. Why do we do this? We do this because we've all heard about MVPs. We've heard so much talk about minimum viable products, but you can't actually get to a minimum viable product if you don't know what is the minimum viable product that will bring you the most money, impact, learning, whatever you're trying to figure out, right? So that quantification helps you figure out, you know what? I've got all these 10 use cases, but all of them are going to generate much less value. And it really means nothing unless I solve this first use case, figure out how to crack it. That establishes product market fit, or that establishes, that my users actually care about it and my solution's working. And if this works, we'll think about the other 9 or other 10, but we've got to solve this one first. That brings you to your roadmap where you've actually created a use case listed in, like all your use cases listed in order of priority, and your priority could be whatever metric you choose it to be. So if your goal is customer retention, that your priority will be very different from someone like me whose goal might be revenue per transaction, right? From the same set of use cases. It's about what you're trying to get at. Once you have your roadmap, I love this part. I absolutely, absolutely love this part. And I'm actually doing one of these tomorrow with my team. Introduce the business case to your team. Your engineering team is just like your designer, a huge partner in this process, and establishing trust and explaining to them why you're doing what you're doing is so critical. Introduce a business case to them. Set your team's expectations. They're not grooming at this point. We're not pre-grooming, we're not grooming. This is the idea. This is the magic we want to build. Present the use cases to the team and the impact you're expecting to deliver. Why do we think this is a viable business case? Why did we spend so much time doing research and figuring out, how users would want to use this? even if it's an improvement. Why do we think this is a valuable improvement? And then hand it over to your designer, who will walk through the full flow, and they'll explain their reasoning. Designers will usually give, a very detailed walkthrough of, here's why we put this, call to action here instead of somewhere else, or the copy here makes more of an impact, or why did we choose certain elements to put here? And that really, really helps build a conversation with the engineering team, because they actually start understanding why you're building what you're building, what's their role in it, and they start thinking about the technical challenges. So you've given them the full view, 10 or 11 use cases, and they're going to start thinking about, okay, these are your assumptions. We don't know this yet, but we understand the goals. How about any red flags? We can't do this. We don't have the technical capability to handle something like this right now. That in itself might help you eliminate use cases or scope it down, or figure out, like, you know what, we're going to have to take an iterative approach. Can we hack it initially? Can we then build a more robust feature? All situations will come up. They'll talk about dependencies where, you know what, another team's building this, part of it. And what you're asking us to do kind of depends on the work they're doing. We can't touch this use case until they're done. And then you'll also hear about unknowns. This is a huge one, because if you start building and your use case has development unknowns, no matter what process you follow and how agile you are, all your estimates will be wrong. Your team will not give you the right story points for it. It doesn't matter how good they are at it. It doesn't matter. You have to give them time to research the unknowns. Once you give them that time, they will actually be able to tell you, here's how we're going to build it. And it's so much easier to estimate it. So make sure you identify these unknowns, and as a PM, you prioritize them before the build. That's why this is so critical. And then you get to, we just had this conversation. My team just told me, here are the use cases that are going to be really hard to do, use cases that have dependencies, and use cases that have unknowns. And now you put that together with your numbers roadmap, and you figure out what's the use case that's going to deliver the most impact. Do we need to plan any tests before or as part of the MVP? Yes, your designer's gone through it, but they might have to change some things based on what we just discussed with the engineering team. Should we be validating any of that? And should we be allocating time for it? What about technical feasibility? Make sure the use case you pick either has no dependencies or unknowns, or you need technical spikes, so you're allocating time for it and you're setting your expectations accordingly. Sometimes, and this happens, and it's horrifying for PMs and for designers, but spikes can lead to major redesigns, because they will find out, I can't do this animation the way you want me to. It's like, okay, we're going to have to figure out a workaround. May not be major most of the time, but it can be. Talking about shortcuts. This is big for PMs. Always ask your team, I want to build this use case, but maybe we're overcomplicating things. Is there an easier workaround or a simpler design we could use? One of the things we do a lot is, instead of building a whole screen, could a takeover work? It's like a half screen pop-up. Maybe that'll do the trick, and it's easier to build. It's not as complicated as a whole screen. It's not great. My designer will be like, Anwesha, we really need to fix that eventually. And I'll be like, yes, next iteration, we'll keep that in our backlog. We'll fix it. We're not going to leave the garbage in there, but this is a compromise. And it's required sometimes, because you've got deadlines, you've got, monetary goals, business goals, and you've got executives who are basically wanting you to deliver everything today. So create that backlog with all the leftover use cases, all of the shortcuts you took, and all of the things that you didn't get to implement. Put those in an organized backlog, and then set up, here's my MVP. here's the initial scope, and this is what I'm expecting to generate to prove product market fit, KPIs or metrics for product market fit. This is so key. Once you've decided on your MVP, do not let scope creep happen. Don't keep going back to your designer and saying, can you add like 5 other things as you're building this design out? Can you add like, you know, all of these like extra little things that may not move the needle at all in terms of your KPI? And if it doesn't make an impact on your final learning goal or your final outcome, do not add it back to scope. I cannot stress this enough, but the only way to successfully deliver design to engineering to build an MVP is really, really be brutal about the feature you're building, and do not build anything that is unnecessary. If it doesn't impact your goal, don't build it, essentially. Don't let that purple guy take over your life. All right. Ooh, I think I went ahead a little bit. There we go. Sophie.
Awesome. Okay. So, when you are starting to brainstorm and think about potential solutions, the first place that you're going to want to start is with wireframes. Sorry, my dog is like sees a ghost or something. Anwesha, can you go down to the next slide, please?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So wireframes, you've probably heard this term before. You've probably made these before, right? This is where you start sketching out your idea, right? It's your space to really understand the basics of the solution that you're thinking about, the idea that you're going to test, right? So these wireframes should be very low fidelity. Think gray. Really strip out any of the visual elements, because that's not really the purpose at this point. And they should really just have kind of the basic content, the information architecture, what you need just to illustrate the idea. And they should map pretty closely to the user flow that you've been identifying and the stories that you've been crafting. Yeah, so the other thing to think about too at this phase is this is your space to explore lots of different ideas, right? So go wild, spend some time thinking outside the box and sketching out some, less likely options that might also help spark your brain for some other things that you could try before you spend a lot of time nailing down the final visuals. Go to the next slide, please. Great. So mock-ups. Probably also heard this term as well, right? This is where you actually start getting into the very final high fidelity branded visuals of what you are designing. This is, where you've already aligned on the skeleton, and now it's time to craft that final vision of what this thing is going to be and how it's going to fit into the larger ecosystem of your product. So style, branding, micro interactions, having everything be pixel perfect and ready to go. Yeah, and next slide, please. Cool. So prototypes. I think we've all probably heard about, made, or interacted with prototypes. So these are, clickable, close to being real life, but, take a lot less time to build. They're for testing. You could build a prototype with wireframes. You could build a prototype with final visuals. You could build a prototype with paper sketches that you made, right? It's not necessarily something that always has to happen at the end. They really help you to get a sense of, like the interaction of the thing, right? How it's going to feel as you are engaging with it. And it's also a good place to, as you are testing things out, right, to test against, are you following best interaction practices, right? Does it feel natural to interact with? Can the user find what they need? Can they quickly discover additional functionality that might be less obvious, right? Yeah, so you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Great. Okay, so once you have figured out really you've identified the skeleton that you're going to build, you've laid on top the final visuals, and you're kind of working through the final vision for this design, you need to start validating the decisions that you're making. So next slide, please. So one way to do this is probably tools that you've heard about before, usertesting.com, Usability Hub. This is a way to really start doing early validation before diving into official usability testing, right? So you can pop up sketches, wireframes, final visuals. You can do this with prototypes, and you can kind of run these very, very fast kind of sanity check tests against the design decisions that you're making, just to level set and make sure that you haven't missed anything, or you haven't made some assumptions that will ultimately impact the user in a negative way. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, user testing. So again, I'm sure you've probably covered this in an earlier session, but I'm going to hit on some of the basics here. So user testing is kind of a large, encompassing term that can be used to talk about lots of different types of testing that can happen at different phases of your project. So usability testing is obviously kind of the more formal version of user testing that we would do towards the end of a design project to make sure that the final deliverable, the final thing that you're going to build, passes muster and is user friendly. They're able to find, actions, what they came there to do, that there aren't any major roadblocks that you've implemented or bad decisions that you've made in terms of the interaction. Beta testing, obviously happens after you're getting ready to launch something. So that could be you get a small segment of customers who agree to participate in a small release, and throughout that cycle, they're engaging with you and sending feedback back to you about the experience. A/B testing is, again, you take what you have existing in the app today, and then you take the new concept that you've created, and you launch them at random to different segments, and then you compare their performance to see whether or not the new version is performing better than the old version, right? Eye tracking, it falls more in line with more formal usability testing, right? So you need to have the right equipment set up in order to be able to do this, but this is where you can kind of track how someone is looking around your app and what their eyes are drawn to, and where they, where they go when you ask them to accomplish certain tasks. True intent is can be done in lots of different ways. You can do this as part of usability testing or interviews. You could also do this through like interruption surveys. When somebody is engaging with your app, you might ask them to provide you some feedback or some context around what they're there to do. And then clickstream obviously is something that you could do through an analytics tool, and it could also be as a something that you cover when you are doing usability testing as well. So next. Cool. And so, as you think about kind of the company that you're working for, the product that you're building, and these different concepts of, are you serving business to consumer? Are you serving business to business? You might mix and match some of these techniques depending on the goal and the audience. So this isn't a hard and fast rule here, but just to kind of illustrate how you might use different methods depending on the type of business, the industry, or the audience. Next slide. Great. So once you've established and tested and you're ready to go and you know what you're going to build, it's time to start the handoff phase. So there's as your design practice grows over time, both with your company and kind of the maturity of your design process, you might start out where with your new designs, you have to redline them. And there are some tools that do this for you. So think Zeppelin, Adobe XD, Figma. To a certain extent, a developer can get in and analyze down to the pixel level, kind of the basic measurements and qualities about the components that you're designing. But over time, right, as you are building your app out, as you are designing more components and growing your design maturity as an organization, you should start moving towards a defined design system. So actually componentizing each of your elements and making them flexible and reusable so that it becomes a lot faster for an engineer to build out new designs into the existing architecture. Next slide, please. Okay, so we think about agile companies, we think about working with engineering teams and handing off those designs. It's a pretty standard rule of practice that at a minimum, designers and designs should be working 2 sprints ahead at least of where the engineering team is. But then when we think about, now those designs are actually being developed, what does that process look like? So kind of outlined here, high level, what a sprint cycle might look like, right? And the card goes into development, a story starts being worked on. The second step, which is super important that it live right here between in development, in QA, is the design review. And the reason that needs to live before QA is because you need to be able to sit down and review the designs that are coming out of development and make sure that they match what the designer or you have created, so that you can catch those inconsistencies early and you can fix them before that story moves on to QA. If you wait until QA, it's too late. And by that point, most likely what's going to happen is any of those inconsistencies or things that have been implemented incorrectly are going to go into a backlog, and it could take a long time before they ever get fixed. So when you're setting up your sprint process and a story is in development, make sure that you set up that specific design review step in your flow. And that could just be you hop on a video call with the developer and they quickly show you what it looks like. And you just kind of check it against and you say, yep, it's good, or no, there's something that needs to be fixed. And then it can go back through that cycle again before it moves on. Next slide, please. So again, in thinking about your design maturity, right? Your practice will develop and evolve over time. So some other types of processes that you might develop could be actually defining the personas of your product. So this is something that you would do during your research around the product and around your users. So you take all that information and you synthesize it down into personas or archetypes of the types of users that are using your product, and those dominant storylines or scenarios for how they're using your product. You could develop a pattern library. So I've kind of outlined for you earlier the design system, which is the development resource, right? So the actual code for the components and their guidelines around their implementation. The pattern library lives on the design side. So that's inside of Figma, inside of Sketch, where you create a reusable library of those patterns and components that make creating new designs much faster, because you already have those patterns ready to go. You already have established the usage of certain components, when to use them, when not to. So that's both the pattern library and the design system kind of go hand in hand, and it's something that you would develop over time. UX metrics are another kind of later design maturity thing to start thinking about. So this is where you've got your product level metrics and how the product is defining success in the market, right? But for the experience of the product, you can also think about metrics and success in the same way. So you can start thinking about what are those high-level experience metrics and experience strategy that we want to shoot for, and then how can we track that back down and think about progress towards those goals. There's a whole lot of resources out there around UX metrics. If you're curious to learn more, I would encourage you to go and read about some of them. It's very interesting, and you can really take it down a rabbit hole. And then the last piece of it is your principles. So, a lot of companies have kind of jumped on the bandwagon of creating principles about their design. But to be frank, most of the time they're pretty useless. It'll be things like make it human or make peace, not war. And like nobody can do anything with that. So what I would suggest is once you've got your product out and you've been working in this cycle for a while and you've been actively making decisions that have served the user the best, think about those decisions, write them down, talk about them as a team, talk about how you got there, the choices that you made, and then ladder those decisions down into your tenets, into your principles that you can use to help you make good decisions moving forward. And they should be constantly evolving. Don't print them out and put them up on the wall, because by the time you do that, they'll probably change. So it's very iterative. They will change over time. You should constantly be checking against them and thinking, does this still apply? Do we need to change it? Have we disproven it with a decision that we've made since? So yeah, I think there's definitely go out and read more about any of these things, and they can happen over time as you grow your practice.
All right. So now that we've got a whole system, you've got your MVP, you've got the designs reviewed, you're ready, you've launched it. It's literally the beginning. There is going to be a very long process in the time from your product actually establishing fit for your product in the market to the time it becomes a mature product, where you're going to constantly be in this loop of identify the problem, figure out the design, build it, test it, get more feedback on what the users, the best feedback you can get is live users using your system. And that can usually change your roadmap, your backlog, and even the design elements, which you've already thought of. So just some things to keep in mind as PMs, because we love to focus on, blinders on, numbers. But it's really important what, Sophie mentioned, having a design review. I call it a UX audit. Same thing. You have to do that. You have to allow yourself and your team the time to do that. One of the things you run into a lot otherwise is, one, what Sophie said, it goes into a backlog and you will never again. Or you're going to get to the, right down to the wire where your code is supposed to go into code freeze and you have a deployment, and your developer is going to be like, here's a video of how it works, and they're going to do a demo, and your designer is going to be on it. They're going to be like, hairline up there, this is different font, this is not bolded. And at this point, it's late and you're pushing out garbage, essentially. So you don't want to do that. The other thing to do is, just because you started out with a priority order in your backlog does not mean that that is going to be the priority forever. Users have the way they use your product, the way they experience it, and how it reflects on your metrics actually changes how you reprioritize your backlog. It changes what we understand about your users, both from a design perspective and from a product perspective. And so don't ever think of your backlog as, I've got a backlog for 2 quarters and I'm going to do this, and this. After the first launch, you're going to realize that half of the things you had in your backlog are garbage because your user doesn't care about it. And the other half of the things that they do care about are not on your backlog. So it's really, really important to keep an open mind there. And finally, your MVP will lead to more user feedback. If you're not getting feedback, you're doing something wrong or something is broken in your analytics. If you're not getting meaningful feedback, if it's not moved the needle, your MVP did nothing. It's not required. There is no fit in the market for it. It either has to move the needle drastically upward or it has to move the needle drastically downward. Both are good, by the way, because one tells you you failed and you need to change something. One tells you you did a really good job. But if it's not doing anything, you're in trouble. So make sure that you're constantly validating whatever you've built with whatever tools you have. Don't cut corners on user research, user testing, any of the methods that Sophie talked about with the A/B testing and eye tracking, whatever you've got at your disposal, use it, because it doesn't stop with the MVP. We're going to have to keep doing it. And with that, here we are at the end of our presentation. So we're open for questions if anyone has any.
Sure, I can go first. I have taken down some notes and some questions as well. Right. So you mentioned the process of going from wireframes to prototypes, mockups, and so on, right? So I wanted to know if there should be any feedback between the stage where we have wireframes and before they are converted into actual prototypes.
Yes, absolutely. That's so really that's the purpose of wireframes, is to help get ideas onto paper so that the entire team can get on the same page and brainstorm together and think about if we're aligned on the same vision for a solution. It's also the time to try out different solutions and then compare them together and think about which ones, do the job really well. So yeah, definitely the wireframe stage is kind of the most important time to get on the same page before you invest all of that time in working up the final visuals, because that does take a long time. And if you work up final visuals and then realize that you've made a poor choice and you need to go back and rework something, it's going to take a lot longer to do that than it would be to do that during the wireframe stage.
Awesome, thank you. And my second question is, considering a situation where we have a page or the part of an application being completely reworked in terms of UI, what would be the best way to inform the user of these changes in case they are not aware of things being moved around or functionality being changed, or if they weren't expecting an animation where they usually don't see one?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So, part of our job as designers is to think about how to make that change less jarring, right? That's kind of one of the foundational tenets of user experience is to try to make those design choices that help the user and they aren't jarring, they aren't surprising, they don't hide functionality that used to be available, right? That's how we get into trouble with our design decisions. I do think, though, there is something to be said for wanting to collect feedback about the launch of something new or about a change. And there's lots of different ways that you could do that, kind of depending on your audience and the strategy behind how you engage with them. So, for example, you could do some sort of in-app rating or survey question where you ask them about their experience, and you ask them to tell you their feelings about the change. You could also do, separately send a survey through email. I think there's pros and cons to the different approaches. So it really just depends on who your users are, how they engage with your technology, and what their preferences are around that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, awesome. And my third question is more of a personal one, because this is what I'm seeing at my current job, and a little clarification would definitely help here. So we follow the agile approach, right? And our teams are split into two, where we have a backend team and a front end team. And what I notice is, since the backend team has much more developers within it, the backend issues are pushed much earlier than front end issues. So would it, or let me ask you a different question. How would you make a decision between pushing functionality and user experience? Should you go with the functionality first, or wait for the user experience to be developed and then push it all together?
So the way I like to do it, and I think this is partly how mature your organization is technology-wise, but if you have a way to gate backend functionality so that it's never exposed to users until the front end is ready, that's the best scenario. I think as a PM, a lot of your work is to juggle and balance back end versus front end. One thing I will say though, if the front end experience hasn't been reviewed and it hasn't been built in its entirety, and you haven't had the time to test the integration, do not launch it. It will be a bad experience. Don't ever do that. So the ideal thing to do, the other part of it is, I don't know if the kind of work you're doing, but what we do is we deal with a lot of microservices on our back end, right? And one of the things that we've evolved over time in my team is we had the exact same problem. We would have, in our case, the reverse. The front end would get way ahead. It's like, that's not even possible. You can't ship something without back-end functionality. And we've had that. So what we would do is we would enforce a discussion around the API contract. How are we building this thing? Back end, front end, design, PM, everyone sit down, talk about the architecture. How are we building it? Create mock data, do it. Create mock data. If this is going to take a long time to build, mock data is going to be the best friend to test out a lot of things, because sometimes when the back end isn't ready, we would still build front end with mock data, and my designer would do a design review and actually say, here's some changes you could make, and we actually had time to make them. So it's really dependent on your specific team, but you have to figure out a way to unblock everybody as a PM. And you should never ship anything that hasn't been tested in its entirety. You should not. Like we tried doing that once and it was a nightmare because we had to roll it back. It's just, there will be bugs that you've not tested in the analytics, in the experience, so don't ever do it. That would be my advice.
Thank you so much.
So my question is, do you always suggest to do the user testing, like usability testing or beta testing, even if there's a small release?
That's a great question. So, it does kind of depend. It depends on the scope of what you were changing and how much the user might need to adjust their behavior. So, sometimes you can get away with just doing, like through usertesting.com or through Usability Hub, like a quick sanity check on the small change. You could even, randomly, if you're tight on budget, you could randomly sample people from within your organization and say, hey, could I have you do a quick, informal usability test with me on this? So there's definitely ways to get around having to spend a lot of money on usability testing, because it can be expensive. But for the larger changes, for the larger projects that you're taking on, it really is invaluable. And it really is an important step, because like Anwesha said, right, the last thing you want to do is launch something and then have to realize there's a major issue with it and you need to roll it back. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, that answered my question. So
and I would actually add to that too. For us, one of the things we've seen work is, especially if it's an app, you can literally A/B test a small change. You don't have to user test it. So half of my users end up seeing the same design element but with different copy than the older version, right? And that can help you validate a lot of the things you're trying to validate. So it's really, I think, to agree with what Sophie said, user testing usually, like, where I found it most helpful has been when you've got 4 different ways or to design the solution and you really don't know which one's the best, and to build all those 4 variants is going to take months. I can't do it. User testing is a very quick way to say, oh, most users had a very positive feedback on one of these flows. Let's start with that. And I think there's a trade-off, but yes, there are ways to test smaller changes without actually going through a very detailed user testing.
got it. My second question is, do you always start with the low wireframes, low fidelity wireframes, or do you sometimes, do you start with pen and paper or sketches?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, wireframes, I don't know. I definitely use that term to encompass lots of different types of things. So that could be sketches on paper, sketches on a whiteboard, it's something that you've made in a design tool. So yeah, I think really it just is whatever works for you to illustrate an idea quickly and to be able to share it out.
Okay, and even for the small changes, like suppose if you want to add a tab and or maybe like a button change or something, so do you rework everything, or just that you just tell your developer that this is the color or this is the design pattern that you have to follow, or not the design pattern, the uh, yeah, design system, that color is what you have to follow?
Yeah, so that's kind of, as that slide about your design maturity as a product, definitely those types of changes become much easier once you are using a design system, or once you have a pretty well established comprehensive product that's built and you can rely on the patterns and components that you already have. So yeah, definitely, early on, when you don't have that, you probably are going to need the designer to create a mock-up for you, or create a visual aid for the changes. But then later on, once you get more well established and you have more resources, you won't have to do that every time. It'll become much faster and much easier to just quickly change something and know how everything is going to fall on the screen.
Got it. And how do you share this with the designers, like with the help of tools like Zeppelin or Figma, or the red lines that you said? So how do you share it with your developers?
Oh, sure. So a lot of those tools have pretty good collaboration capability. So like Figma, for example, right? Anyone can get into Figma that's part of your team and can access that redline functionality, or look at the CSS information. I mean, it's not, you can't copy and paste it because it's just not good enough code, but a developer can go in and kind of pull the information that they need to write their classes and things like that. And Zeppelin is, I don't know if you're familiar, but it's you can't design in Zeppelin, but you can upload your designs and then access that same redline functionality. So yeah, that's how we're doing it. I don't know, Anwesha, is that how?
So yeah, we did we would do sketch and abstract, and then just the inspect element, because we had the design, like the pattern library in there, and we'd already built a design system out of it. So it was really just understanding, okay, how many pixels, what's the spacing? That's really what they would go and see. And we're moving to Figma now, so that's, oh, I love Figma. Can't even. But anyway, I love it. But yes, so yeah, that's essentially how we do it.
Yeah, actually, and then, sorry, I have to add on to your question, actually. So, and then, thinking about the design system that you build out, the pattern library, another thing that can really help speed up design changes and development is inside of that design system, right, where you have the actual code samples for the components, and a developer can go in and change aspects of that component and copy and paste it over. You also want to put in not just how the component is built, but the usage guidelines, right? You want to share that with the team so that anyone can access it and know, oh, in these types of use cases, we use this component this way. And it really standardizes everything and speeds it up. Sorry, I think I interrupted someone.
Yeah, I was just saying, I've seen or used these tools from both the sides. Like, I was a developer before, so it's really useful to have, these guidelines and the redlining as you spoke about, and it makes it so much more easier as a product manager to convey your thoughts. Yeah, I think Nagasa is asking a question.
Yes. Hi, Sophie. Hi, Manisha. I think it's a great presentation. Thank you for your time. My question was...
You are not clearly audible.
Let me take my headphones.
Yeah, this is better.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, great. Thank you.
One of the questions I had is that usually between the teams is always difference of opinion. Especially, I feel like the teams that I've worked with, there was this difference of opinion between the QA and the design teams, and then comes to the point where we have to determine how much of the product success can be attributed to the design, right? And that varies among with different products and also the categories. So, in your experience, so how much does design contribute to a product success, and how would you deal with those difference of opinions in general?
Sorry, differences of opinion between who?
I think she said designer and QAs.
Oh, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. You said differences of opinion between
the QA teams and the design teams.
Differences of opinion in what the design should be?
In terms of the functionality that we desire from the product, and in terms of the creativity that they want to bring into the product, and like how do you deal with that in general, and how much of the design capability is how can that contribute to the product success, and how do you assess that? I think assessing that has been difficult for me, at least when I was working. So
I feel like there's two questions there.
Right. Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. So I'll and then Anwesha. Yeah. So when it comes to creative differences, I guess I'll call them, between design and QA. So that is definitely, that's not uncommon. And the way that I have always approached that is I get everyone involved in the design as early as possible. So when I'm in those early stages of wireframing, of concepting and coming up with how we are going to solve the problem, which is one of the great things about Figma, anyone can get into it and see what's going on and leave comments. That's the time when the engineers get in. I invite QA into that space because they have great ideas. They have great feedback. And I want to make sure use that information, that knowledge is respected and not lost, right? And that way, like for my process, if a component, a feature, whatever it may be, is going through our sprint, and the first time that a QA person is seeing it is when they are QAing it, I have failed them. That's failure. So yeah, that's my answer to the first question. And Wesh, I don't know if you want to add anything.
I think you're absolutely right. Like that's kind of the reason why I like to do business reviews. I think part of it is on the designer, but a lot of it is on the PM. Enabling these conversations, understanding that your team is not just an executor, they have ideas, bringing them to the table up front. That's why I love doing it, because it's like, I need to hear your ideas, but I also need my developers to be comfortable in slacking at my designer and asking them a question. And I need them to be like, hey, I just saw this design and I have a little feedback, and I shouldn't have to be the middleman. I shouldn't have to be the approver. It can simply be a conversation between my designer and my developer and my QAs, and for them to feel comfortable that we're all in this together. Like we fail or succeed together. There is no us and them.
Yes.
And I think a lot of the time when I've seen conflicts happen, they happen because a lot of people feel like they've been kept out of the loop. They've had no voice in the decision-making process, and that's not a great feeling to have, because it's basically disempowering people. I think that's probably why it's a really good idea to just get everyone in. Even if it's a half-baked idea, it's just good to get them in a room and have them look at it, give you feedback, no matter what their role is at the company. That would definitely be.
So getting people involved at a very early stage is what you suggest.
Yeah, don't push yourself to create that best, like, final polished product before you take it to people. I do think, though, that the company's culture matters here a little bit. It's not easy to do that if your company is going to view you coming in with a half-baked design as your incompetence. I think setting that expectation and building that culture takes time. And as a PM, you can do it for your team, but you can't really do it org-wide. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. I think we've definitely been in positions like that before for many of us, where it's like, for my team, I can do this, but then like no one else appreciates it, or your manager is asking you, why are you showing me this? It's like a half-baked thing. Show me the final thing. And that's a wrong expectation to have.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah. And then your second question was about the laddering design to a product success.
Yes. Kind of the design versus development debate again. How much does design contribute to success versus development? And how do you prioritize sometimes when there is a conflict of interest or difference of opinion is what I was getting at.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the same thing with QA, right? Like engineers have to be involved early on. They just have to be, and it will ultimately serve the product better because they do have really good ideas and they should be used. Those ideas should be surfaced and considered, and and then the ROI. There's tons of, I think, opinions. There's tons of methods, opinions about how to prove the ROI of design specifically. I think I prefer to go down the UX metrics type of route if I'm looking to specifically dig into, what did the design add to the overall success of the product. But a lot of times even just the success metrics that you as a PM are picking for the feature that you're launching or whatever it may be, the value of the design can be kind of baked into that. So it kind of just depends. But yeah, I think in my personal opinion, I prefer the UX strategy and metrics type of route if I'm looking to really prove the value add.
You mentioned that we can read about UX metrics somewhere. Is there any resource or knowledge base that you would suggest?
Oh, there's so many. There's so many out there. I would say Jared Spool. I don't know if you're familiar with the name. He's pretty well known in the UX space. He has some pretty good articles about it and about some good frameworks that you can follow and how to think about crafting your experience strategy and then kind of working that down into specific metrics.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, and the other thing I think I would add to that is sometimes UX metrics are hard to communicate up the chain of command as a PM because they don't, CEOs and CTOs, and they don't respond to that. They really care about hard numbers. One of the things that I've seen work is when you do A/B tests, you can also just A/B test a design and be like, nothing else changed, and all we did is improve the branding. And here's how our needle moved. And it works. Sometimes it is more effort, but I think anytime there's a debate where, why are we doing this? Or why is the design, or like, why do we have to be so picky about the design? One of the best things to do is to say, let's test it. Let's just actually live test it. Let's see how it does. And 90% of the time, I will tell you a crappy design will fail, even if everything else is in there. Oh. So, yeah.
I think I agree. Yes, I agree. I disagree a little bit on whether or not technical leaders care about UX metrics. I think it depends on the delivery, right? And that's why when you are doing all of this work to understand the user journey and understand where those pain points and frustrations are, you can use that, right, to craft the storyline of how good the experience could be and how that great experience impacts the success of the business. And then you can turn around and say, and here's how much it's costing the business every day that we don't do that. And that's a pretty powerful story to tell. And, a lot of times too, technical leaders, or really leaders in general, really have a great grasp of how bad a product is or how bad those frustrations are. Sometimes they just don't know, and it's really about kind of surfacing that storyline to them and helping them understand. So yeah, I agree. It's like it just depends on the approach. It depends on the team, and I think it's a good mix of both things: testing and thinking about how to tell the story.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, because sometimes testing can be too much effort for like something that could be proven very easily with telling the story. So yeah, that's definitely true.
Awesome. Thank you very much. That was a great discussion. Thank you.
I have one more question. So, what type of documentation do you create, like design or prototype documentation for the team or for yourself, maybe to look in the future?
Like for handoff or for recording ideas?
I do not know. I mean, I was just reading somewhere that PMs also create some kind of documentation related to design. So maybe like a design documentation or prototype documentation. So I was just wondering, like, what kind of documentation the team would be creating, or what would be the use of that.
I personally just go off of the designs my designer has, and I annotate them with comments. And usually in our weekly syncs or bi-weekly syncs, because one thing that this is a personal opinion, I hate processes. I think processes really slow us down. And I don't really put a lot of weight on, I love best practices, don't get me wrong. There's a way of doing things that gets you where you need to be quickly. But documenting unnecessarily when it's already there in like a design, like in abstract or in Figma, I usually just like to go annotate it, and I'll meet with my designer bi-weekly or weekly, whenever we do, and we'll go over those comments if they haven't been addressed already. And usually the outcome of that is, okay, we're going to go fix this, put it in the backlog, create a story. That's usually the approach. I don't know, Sophie, how, like, is that how y'all do it?
Yeah, I'm trying to think, like, what we tend to do early on is we just tend to use our requirements document as the place where everything, like, that's the source of truth about a project. And so for us, what that usually looks like is it starts off pretty lean. And we, as we're thinking about the solution and we're thinking about, what's the MVP versus what are future visions, we kind of start outlining the functionality there, just bullet point, here's what the MVP is going to be able to do, and here's what it's going to affect versus future versions. And that kind of feeds into what we start putting down in the designs. And then, definitely we rely on kind of the internal functionality of Figma to track and maintain kind of feedback, comments, clarifications about how something works, or what the design of the final component should be, the different states of the component. It's kind of what we do.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I thought of another thing to add to the question just a second ago about telling the story to leadership. Oftentimes, what is super powerful is when you've done a usability session with someone and you've had them do some tasks in the product that really illustrate how frustrating it is to use, send that to the leadership person and say, hey, I think you'd be interested in watching this. That's really powerful. There's also some tools out there like Lookback or Full Story that you can install basically into your product and track and watch recorded user sessions and kind of see what they're doing and see how long it takes them to accomplish a task. Or it even tracks rage clicks if you want to see like really like clicking on a thing because it's not doing the functionality that they expect it to. So lots of good tools out there. I just wanted to mention that.
Awesome. I had one more question where These days we're seeing this new org kind of called product analytics, and also designers going out there and doing UX UI research before they actually come up with designs, before they kind of interviewing the existing customers and probably the future customers, and also getting feedback from beta testing. So, which is again analyzed by product analytics team, and a lot of companies are actually hiring folks in product analytics. So, how far, how do you think they can add value, or would you hire a product analytics person? Do you think a product analytics person would add value to your team right now? What's your take on that?
I mean, I love my analytics people. I know Anwesha loves analytics people too, because she used to be one. Yeah, so I'm trying to think like of some good examples of the things that we've been doing together. So I just started on working on some new like the developer side of our experience and the products that developers are using, and we weren't tracking analytics on it, and that was like the first thing. It was okay, well, we can't do anything until we get that going, because we have no idea how it's being used today, because nobody's paying attention to it. And then past jobs, I worked really closely with one of our analytics team members to put together a dashboard, really, of experience metrics, and it was based on the Google Heart framework, if y'all are familiar with that, but we expanded it a little bit so we could track all the kind of basic things like time on task, and what were some of the other, like frequency of use, right? But then there were some other measures that we came up with. We came up with ways to track like the intensity of use of a feature, like the intensity of the interaction with a feature over time. And so that was something we could use to look kind of on a feature by feature basis and go in, and we could use that dashboard to answer questions early on in a project about how something was being used, but we could also use it whenever we launched something new to help us go and validate, is this performing as well as we think it is? Are we meeting those goals that we set out for ourselves? So yeah, super important.
Awesome. Great to hear
that. Share what she thinks.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think the term product analytics is very broad also. So it's not just user research or generative research. For us, a lot of the work we do, where my designers, my developers, all of us get involved, is smoke testing. It really, like, it'll be a feature in the app that does nothing. It really does nothing. It's very frustrating for users, I'm sure, but it's basically, it gives me a signal on whether I want to build this thing out or not. And all I'm doing is tracking that signal. Did they actually tap on that CTA? Does it matter to them? And that's product analytics. So I think at the end of the day, you absolutely have to have someone who can work on data with you. That's non-negotiable. Having said that, I know people who do user research or have been in that role for a long time bring a whole new flavor. Also, it's not just like data driven. They know how to ask the right questions, and they're open-ended questions. I think that skill set is not something PMs have. We are very conditioned to ask the questions we know will give us the answers we're looking for. If that makes sense, right?
Right.
And a lot of people that do user testing and user research, their mindset is to open up a conversation. So you didn't like this. Why didn't you like this? What would have made it better? Instead of saying, would having this instead make it better? They have a different way of asking that question. So at the end of the day, I think absolutely have a data person, but also if your product needs more human interaction, like interpersonal interaction skills and user research, that's another skill set you should definitely invest in. I think Sophie would agree with that as well.
Totally. Yeah, it really is. Talking to people and collecting and bringing back defendable results is a science, right? That takes time to learn. Just like, it's qualitative data is just as scientific and important as quantitative. It's just a different skill set that's developed using different expertise. And it's hard. Talking to people is hard. It's not as easy as you think it is. Writing survey questions is so hard. It really is a science. And yeah, if you want to collect that kind of qualitative information that you can trust and that other members of your organization can trust and use, it takes time and expertise.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I think we're at that awkward silence phase where there's no more questions.
Anything else?
Oh, I mean, I can keep talking and asking if no one else has questions. Well, y'all could probably describe how y'all got to where you are. I mean, with the COVID situation, everyone's talking about how I got here. And then if y'all want to do how I got here, that would be great.
Yeah, we can. Anwesha, go for it.
Oh, I was going to say, Sophie, go for it first.
Yeah, sure. So, I actually got my start in UX kind of in a really roundabout, accidental way. I used to be a ballet dancer in Chicago. Yep. And moved. I'm native Texan, but moved to Chicago to work professionally there with some companies, and just ended up had a long-standing injury that kind of took me out of the game, and I had to kind of reevaluate my life choices and figure out what I was going to do. And I thought I was going to go be a developer. I got into a dev boot camp and everything, and then I kind of accidentally fell into a UX internship in the interim and ended up falling in love with it. So that was my first company. It was in Chicago. It was it's now owned by DocuSign, but it was called Spring CM. It's a cloud content management company. And then I moved on to work in recreation and outdoors, worked with the federal government on the websites where you go book a campsite at a national park or a ticket to visit a national monument. I worked with the state governments on like the apps and the POS systems where you buy your hunting and fishing license. Then I moved on to Sabre, which is where I met Anwesha, and worked on the developer experience at Sabre, kind of all their hundreds of APIs, their portals, sandbox, the demo apps, all that stuff for travel. Then I went to a small startup in Chicago that built HR technology. And now I'm at BigCommerce. So that's my story.
Pretty inspiring.
It's a pretty cool story. Yes. Sophie she's a rock star.
Right.
Well,
An actual rock star, right? An actual rock star.
Yeah. I actually have a background in computer science engineering from Delhi, India, and I moved to UT Dallas for my PhD in management science. And then once I got that, I started at Sabre as a data scientist, was in that role for 2 years, and I was doing a lot of work for both airlines and for hotels.
And she was brilliant, by the way.
Stop. But one of the things that actually got to me after 18 months, about 2 years on the job, I had no control on what was being built. I literally I created these models and found these amazing things, and we would present that to customers, and customers would be like, when can I get this? And my product manager, whoever they might be at the time, would say, oh, we don't have funding for this for 2 more years. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. Like, really? And that's basically when I kind of started looking at opportunities to switch to product management. And I got really lucky in that there was a team that was looking for a data scientist and a product manager for data science at the same time. And the director of that team actually reached out to me asking me to join as a data scientist. And I negotiated my way into the product management role instead because I didn't want to switch into another data science role. So I basically asked her, I said, you can interview me, see if I have the product mindset, and I will learn, but give me a chance. And it worked out. Also, we were working with APIs, and before I started, my entire team had not worked with UX. So I basically brought that to the table. A lot of the grooming and feature elaborations, we had an agile coach, and he was really like hitting the wall with our team, and we actually made it happen. We made it happen with my teams. And then I actually, for personal reasons and visa issues, did not want to stay in the US any longer. And so last year, I basically moved with a job at Hopper to Canada. And I joined the hotels team at Hopper as well. And it's a complete mind shift because, you know, Sabre was a B2B and this is a B2C, and we move way fast here. Like, we're frugal and very fast, but yeah, so I love it. I mean, I absolutely enjoy being in this workspace. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think there's a lot to learn for us to not succumb to injuries and to negotiate your way to the role that you want.
Yeah, go after what you want.
I mean, Sophie's still a great dancer. Don't get me wrong. She's still amazing. Injury or not.
Awesome.
Thank you for.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you. It's great.
The session was super fun.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. And, you know, feel free to reach out with questions or anything.
Yeah, reach out to us on LinkedIn, and yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Anwesha and Sophie.
Thanks for having us.
Have a good
Thank you,
night.
guys.
Have a good night.
You
Bye.
too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.